Welcome back to the second session of this conference, which is on Greco-Persian intellectual exchange. And it's my pleasure to introduce Margaret Miller as our first speaker. She's the Arthur and Renee George Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Sydney. At the other end of her academic career, she received her PhD from Harvard. Working with Emily Vermeule, among others. She specializes in the archaeology and material culture of the ancient Mediterranean and has just completed a book on the representation of Persians in Attic art. So please join me in welcoming her.
Not only am I delighted to be here, but already this morning I've learned so much and been so stimulated by what's going on. The very first thing I said in the book I've just completed is, I thought I knew what a Persian was, and still I started writing about Greek representations of Persians, and I realized the question was far more complicated than I had ever understood as a simple classical scholar. Now, today I don't really have an argument, but a range of observations and thoughts that I hope sharing with you will help me concretize my own thinking about how I should work with them. It's to do with myth. One principle well known to students of myth is very important in this social history of Greek myth, that while the underlying structures of myth are eternal, the surface noise of each articulation of myth is highly particularistic and reflects well the fundamental attitudes and preoccupations of a society. Now, the basic narrative of Greek myths tended not to change over time, though some episodes might be preferred in one period over another. Yet, as every student of Greek tragedy knows well, the characterization of individual mythical figures could alter with every retelling. Characterization is one of those surface noises. My focus today is on a different kind of surface noise, which I tend to call, for lack of a better word, the ethnicization of Greek myth, and in fact, in art. In its later phases, it is, in fact, a Persianization of Greek myth in art. But it would be wrong to insist on vestimental visual transformations of mythological figures, of all mythological figures. The very variability in ethnic transformation offers nuanced insight. So today I would like to sketch out some interesting phenomena in the representations of myth in the visual arts, especially Attic black figure and red figure pottery. Now I press something to go forward. Herodotus notoriously commenced his account of relations between Greece and the East with a series of mythological rapes, and so overtly linked Persian with Trojan in an overarching paradigm that set East and West in as opposite poles. The publication of the now not so very new elegy by Simonides for Plataea, the Battle of Plataea, shows that he too, very shortly after the Persian invasions, drew analogy between the heroes of the Persian War and the recent struggle against the Persian Empire. Now, some time ago, Edith Hall pointed out a phenomenon that she tracked through textual evidence by which Greek myth was alienated. Now, I use this word in the legal sense of change of ownership. Greek myth was cast out from Greek into foreign lands. Hall argued that it was a deliberate and conscious mythopoiesis towards the creation of a new national Athenian identity in the 5th century. She pointed to a number of figures, like Medea, for which there seemed to be a prior tradition of residence in Greece. And to quite an extent, the evidence of art corroborates her observations. But even as representations in art are more numerous than extant texts, I find the imagery can aid understanding about the growth of what we might call ethnic consciousness in Greece. Now, it is clear that ethnic dress and race were observable and observed by the middle 5th century in art, though it's very rarely represented in art. We'll come back to this later, but the thing to keep in mind is that when ethnicity is depicted in 6th century art, it is characterized by accuracy and detail and is normally found in figures insignificant in myth. An interesting related phenomenon is the replication of foreign image systems in archaic art. I show two notorious examples. The first, the Cairetian Hydria, in which a gigantic Heracles tramples Egyptian foes, Busiris and his priests, in a manner of the triumphant pharaoh. This, of course, is usually housed in Vienna, but now is actually in Los Angeles. Yes. Very exciting to see, I must say, when visiting the collection the other day. And the Laconian Arcesilas cup, where weighing silphium adopts an important image from the Book of the Dead. The weighing of the soul against the feather of Mat is a model for commercial transaction. It is clear that some Greek painters were well aware of foreign image systems, though by and large they chose to ignore them, and this is significant. Now, ethnic dress could still be observed and represented in 5th century arts, though I note towards the end of the century a blurring of precision. But there are two intertwined issues to consider here: when and how ethnic and race became a point of interest in the Greek mind, and when and how representation of myth undergo an ethnic and racial transformation. I tend to identify 4 modes in which a figure is iconographically identifiable as of foreign ethnicity. The first, vestimental or system of dress. This is, of course, the most familiar to modern peoples, to the modern eye, but it has interesting and significant variation in classical Athens. We have then the commutative, by which I mean the companion of the figure who is being identified as foreign. We have the compositional. I've shown you a good example of that already. This is the use of Near Eastern visual language, the quotation forms, compositions. And then we have the attributive, which is hard to identify. This is items associated with a figure, more problematic, but I note most recently the exciting recognition of a Thracian bit in Amazon iconography, for example. Yes. But in the early periods of the Iron Age, we find no clear discussion, no clear presentation of foreign ethnicity. And there have been those who argue that Orientalism was already visible in Homer right at the start of the verbal remains of early Greek thought. Examples there are in plenty that pointed to Trojans being emotionally, overly emotional, timorous, and so on and so forth. Already Zahn in the 19th century, 1896, pointed out that Trojan heroes behaved just like the Aegean heroes. For every instance, every passage in which a Trojan seems less than heroic, he could point to a similar passage in which Achaeans acted or spoke in the same manner. Ethnicity did not matter in the heroic world. It was more preconceived notions about how Easterners acted and thought that allowed other readings of Homer to arise. If we look at the art of the period, we find that no trace of ethnic differentiation between Achaean and Trojan. This is no surprise to any of you, I'm sure. I appeal to this Rhodian plate in London, whose inscriptions make it clear the identity of the combatants. We have Greek Menelaus battling Trojan Hector. Their equipment and weapons are basically identical. The helmets differ for variatio rather than for any kind of semantic reason. Already in the 6th century, though, a range of ethnic hints become visible. I think that the most notorious example of a complex of thought about race and ethnicity in the 6th century appears in the case of Memnon, king of Ethiopia, son of the dawn, Eos. He came as an ally to fight with the Trojans. In art, he appears as a Greek hoplite, but he is accompanied by attendants who are characterized by race and weaponry as black, as Africans. So Ethiopia is from Africa, according to this commutative iconography. The scheme allowed the viewer to recognize the topographical referent without compromising the Greek heroic quality of Memnon. So we have here an attempt, a desire to show the, shall we say, the topographical home of Memnon, but not a desire to show that he is non-heroic, non-Greek, non-Greek heroic code. If we go to Priam, king of Troy, we have an especially interesting case. Imagery for Priam in the 6th century, in the 5th century, the 4th century, is usually very sympathetic, in keeping with his tragic fate. We have the imagery of the ransom of Hector from Achilles, where the body of Hector is under the dining couch of Achilles, and the aged Priam comes to seek suppliancy, really, to get the body back, a very tragic moment in the epic cycle. And we find the early representations have the basic narrative elements. But in time, the ransom scenes are elaborated. And we find, very interesting already, very early on, that Achilles is himself demarcated as a person of wealth, of social standing, because he has an Iranian lobed bull. And indeed, some have called this the Iranisches Lebensideal, already appearing in the Archaic period. That may be too tight an description to Iran, but basically Eastern artifacts as signs of social standing are visible here. But in time, the ransom becomes more elaborate with the procession of gift bearers, some of whom carry, again, the Near Eastern metalware bowls. As in this Ultas cup, I apologize for my terrible photographic skills. And in the early 5th century, we find elaboration of the ransom of Hector with a full procession of figures following Priam to the couch of Achilles. This is almost a case of compositional orientalization or Persianization. The point here is not that Priam is necessarily Eastern, so much as that Achilles is honored in the same mode as the Persian great king by the conducting of gifts in procession to him. So on the Vienna Skyphos, we have Achilles already has Persian bowls, and Priam is bringing him some more Persian bowls. So we have his presentation in sort of high social standing in keeping with the dominant aristocratic ideology of the day. The important thing is that these are gifts of the elite and they work within such a mode. The compositional Persianization is something that first drew my attention, and that is that we see a process by which a number of mythological figures metamorphose over the course of time from developing an Oriental setting to having specific Persian attributes. And I show you here briefly Midas, king of Phrygia, who at the capture of Silenus, he is clearly represented as Greek in dress. He is inscribed, do we know for sure that he must be Midas. He does have an attendant who sees him wearing a special hat capturing Silenus, so we have a bit of commutative orientalization going on here. But the interesting thing is he transforms from Greek to a Persian character in terms of the iconography. He has compositional as well as commutative orientalization. It may even be argued that the garment he wears is a misquotation of the Persian court robe. Now, earlier I was interested in trying to establish just how any Athenian artist could even know enough about Persian imagery to be able to capture it as a sort of daily event painting in the Keramikos. Now I'm quite satisfied there's lots of vehicles by which Greeks could know about Persian imagery. And what makes this now interesting is the implication that for somebody thinking in the mid-5th century BC, that the model of the Persian king made an appropriate model for any royal figure, subconsciously rather than actively, perhaps. So it could be that the great king shaped the concept of royalty for people working in the 5th century in Athens. We find interesting shifts in ethnicity, and my favorite example of that is Busiris. Now, you've already seen how compositionally he was presented in the Egyptian mode, Heracles was presented quoting the Egyptian mode. But when we move into the 5th century, we move from a time where we have really serious attempts to depict aspects of Egyptian dress and even headgear to a continuing idea of adding the Egyptianness of the subject by the shaven heads of the priests, the use of circumcision of the Egyptians. But then Busiris goes Persian. By about the mid-5th century, we start to have the subject is not the trampling of the priests by Heracles. The subject is the procession of Heracles to Busiris. The whole processional iconography is used here. And unfortunately, the cup in Berlin is fragmentary. The crucial bit's missing. But if you look at his legs, Busiris does have anaxirides on. He's presented as a Persian. The really best example is that relief Lekathos you see over on the right-hand side. It is hard to make it out. And indeed, for many years, this was misunderstood as being a representation of Silenus and Midas being the enthroned figure. But if you look at it closely, the naked figure in front of the enthroned king is wearing a lion skin. So this is Heracles being brought to Busiris. So here too, Busiris is presented in the sort of Persian royal garb. Other shifts of ethnicity are interesting. We've noticed Memnon and how he tends to be presented as a Greek-style warrior. Even in the early 5th century, the Berlin painter, we only can see the gentleman on the right is Memnon because of an inscription. We are familiar with his commutative orientalization in the past. But then, in a really interesting piece in the Louvre mid-century, we find another battle of Memnon and Achilles, but Memnon had fallen on the ground, has Persian clothes on. Now, I apologize for my rotten photography. The photograph you see on the right is the old published image. But when I finally got to look out of the Louvre, I found it in fragments. I was trying to hold it in such a way that you could see the subject. But it truly is Memnon wearing Persian clothes. So he's completely transformed his ethnic identity in this representation. So we run to this problem of what I've been calling the Persianization of Greek myth. By the end of the century, one almost gets the impression, the 5th century, that all other ethnicities are submerged into this single Persian ethnicity, the sort of one universal non-Greek ethnicity. And that's a lovely idea, but in fact, as I investigate it further, I find that not every ethnic mythological person Persianizes, and even within families, there's a variability. What is going on? I ask myself whether really we have to do with fundamental shifts in ideology rather than specifically inventions spawned by the Persian War victories or spawned by dramatic productions. For example, just random examples. Andromeda, she started off life as a Greek in myth and in art. She's turns to a vaguely Asian sort of figure by the middle of the century, and she even has Ethiopian attendants, so her African relationship is presented with her Persian dress, Ethiopian attendants, and then we finally get her wearing gloriously the Persian Candace in the crater in Berlin. Now, so Andromeda metamorphoses, as it were, vestimentally over this period. Danaus, king of Egypt, gets a special kind of attributive orientalization. He gets a fan bearer. We can find many different examples. We don't have time for all of those, so I've turned to Troy, where I started. And that is the whole phenomenon that is that of selective Persianization as viewed through the princes of Troy. Now here you see, in the 6th century, okay, I admit it's not Attic, it's Chalcidian, but there we go, an interesting crater in which we see the conjugal relations of the sons of Priam. We have Hector and Andromache farewelling in a sober and appropriate going off to battle format. Behind, we have Paris and Helen, and she is turning away from him. She'll have nothing to do with him. Paris is presented not in full hoplite armor. He has his bow, so he is distinguished from his brother in this piece. Well, if we look at the whole story of Paris, the best way of looking at it is the Judgment of Paris, where we find interesting changes over time, and I suppose I should be able to point this out, where we start off in the sort of 560, the archaic judgments of Paris. Paris is a mature man with a beard. He responds with surprise or even runs away when the 3 goddesses are brought to him by Hermes. When we get to the 5th century, Paris is a lovely pastoral figure, as we almost have in the Homeric or the epic tradition, pastoral figure sitting on his rock. He becomes a bit of a country bumpkin, sort of lumpish, and then he starts wearing curious clothes. Now this I find particularly interesting. This is basically, again, mid-5th century it's starting to happen. And this piece really bugs me. I'd like you to help me with it if you can. It's the earliest example of what is normally called the Phrygian cap. I see that's the name it's given. I do see nothing Phrygian about it. And I really want to have help finding out what the ethnicity of this cap actually is. But anyhow, there it is. And then at the top we have a slightly later representation of Paris in more full Oriental dress. But the most glorious, so we have this general translation from Greek Paris to Asian Paris, and then to full-blown Persian. And the classic example of this is the Helena painter Calpis in St. Petersburg, where Paris is seducing Helen. He's wearing his Candace, he's wearing his sleeved garment, he's wearing his Anaxirides, probably made from the new Sprang technique, but absolutely every inch Persian. Now, in contrast with that, so we have to ask ourselves a question: how did Paris start being presented as a Persian? What's the moment? What's the motivation? Why Paris? And one possible line of approach is to look at the earliest representation of Paris as a Persian that we know of, and that is the Lesky of the Canadians at Delphi, where Pausanias, describing the painting of the Nequia, the underworld scene, comments that Paris is clapping his hands, and he's quite puzzled at this, so that 19th century scholarship has suggested that maybe Paris is not clapping his hands, but showing his Persian ethnicity by dancing the Oklazma dance. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's the earliest I can get to. And here is I'm pointing at the wrong thing. Here is a representative Persian dancing the Oklazma in a piece in London. So we have Paris sort of hanging there. In contrast, we have Hector. Now, Hector never changes his ethnicity. He dresses for battle, he farewells his parents, he's always only identifiable by the inscriptions that tell us Priam, Hecabe, Hector on his pots, and he basically, his departure, Hector's departure, becomes almost paradigmatic as the Klieg's departure. The hoplite going off to war, to battle, we hope with happy outcome. In later 5th century, we have another departure of Hector with, it's labeled Cassandra. She has a nice fiale there. And beside them is the departure with Paris. Now, I don't have a good detail of this. I'm afraid it's not as nicely fully published as I can use. But you can see that we have, even here, a contrast between Hector, the noble hoplite, who's naked as becomes the heroic hoplite in the late 5th century, and Paris, who is, well, he actually is dressed now, and he's got his helmet. But in being dressed, he's less heroic than Hector, which is a curious, same message, but different media in presenting their relative personalities. If we go to Priam, he Persizes slightly. He is the sorry figure on the left side there at the edge of a departure, nicely labeled, wearing a foreign-looking dress. We see him, yes, familiar to you all, the amazing piece imitating Italian form, but actually, among many images, we have what looks like Priam on an altar, wearing what looks like a sleeve jacket, but the sleeves aren't visible. So definitely a Persianizing garment in this interesting example. When we get, it could be Priam Persizes fully at the end of this century in Attic, but I don't have a good example of it. One possibility is a fragment in the Agora, where you can see a figure on an altar. You see the Anaxirides, the legs, flanked by two other figures in violent action. So it could be it's his death. We do certainly have Priam as Persizing very commonly in South Italian imagery. Is the norm there. So we have a range of different kinds of Persianizations going on in the imagery. And I note that the range comes from sort of, shall we say, the compositional, the adoption of Near Eastern procession imagery for use in specific subject matters. We have this fascinating phenomenon that enthroned figures seem to be thought of in the Persian mode. They're not Persianized in the sense that they're being treated as if they are Persian figures, but the composition in which they're framed. People think about the Persian model of monarchy when they're thinking monarch in this period, which is very interesting. And then we have the fascinating phenomenon of the translations of other figures of myth. They're not quite Persian, they're certainly not Greek, but they have elements of Persian dress going on. And I ask myself what really is happening here and how and why does it happen? It has been long thought that the Persian invasions particularly gave a focal point in the relations between the Greek mainland world and the Persian Empire more generally. But I'm finding now as I work that is not a sufficient commencing point, that some of these phenomena are happening already before the Persian Wars. They're happening as a result of the extensive contact with Western Anatolia, as Beth has told us all about, the best example I can find of that is this extraordinary, very little known piece in Florence, where we have a departure of Hector with chariot and with a commutative orientalizing figure beside him. It is said that Hector is identified by inscription with an I think it's an eta, but I can't see it on the picture. But what's really interesting is the right-hand figure of the scene is somebody fully dressed in Persianizing dress, if not quite Persian dress, clearly labeled Paris. And this is absolutely before the Persian invasion of Greece. So the ideas of thinking about different ways of ethnicity, different rethinking of Greek myth is already happening well before that time. It's a longer process. So in sum, I'm probably running out of time, aren't I? In sum, basically, when I look at the phenomenon of Persianization of myth, I think there's genuinely something happening there. I can see enough good examples of real Persian ideas appearing in representations of Greek mythological characters or within the wider Greek myth cycle. But it is not absolute, it's not consistent, it's not universal, and it's not just a matter of topography, because topography shifts in the way it's presented. We seem to have instead ideas of ways of thinking, ways of visualizing narrative are coming to the Greek artist minds, rather than necessarily the stories that are being told, for which we'd have to have more, shall we say, text, even on the Iranian side. What's really going on? I'm suspecting that, as I've just written here, Persia is a model for royal authority. It's a model for magnificent procession. And with the dubious question of what's happening with Paris, and I still haven't quite settled what I'm going to do with Paris, he's definitely set in opposition with his heroic family. And the opposition is denigrating in the sense that he is the great seducer. He's the one who really goes all out and wears glorious clothes. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. But essentially, there's something going on here, and I'm hoping over the next 3 months to get my head more closely around how best to approach it and how to explain and articulate it. Thank you.
I have a question for Meg, actually. Thank you very much. It was very inspiring. I will return to shifting in ethnicity that you focused very well. So am I right in supposing that Persian ethnicity was perceived as a monolith, whereas it was patently not? And if so, how can we explain that? Is it only ignorance, or it was done on purpose?
I knew that, I'm afraid. This is the $64,000 question. It is a fascinating matter. I can speak if I try hard. No, I have been astonished as I studied the representations of Persians in Attic art, the extent to which, at first I thought the Athenian artists were making up all the Persian clothing, and the later we go in the 5th and into the 4th century, I was imagining that a lot of it was absolute hogwash. But then the more I looked at the representational arts from Iran and elsewhere in the Persian Empire, I came to see that the variability of Persian dress on Persian figures, like a historical, or shall we say, art, Persian figures in Attic vase painting, I could almost point for point a parallel with arts of Iran, in the wider world of Iran. So my struggle right now is I'm using this term Persian. I sometimes feel I should use the term Iranian as implying a sort of broader, shall we say, ethnicity, if I can put it that way. Okay, that's one part of it. The other part of it is, when are Anaxirides Persian? When do they say the end? This is the kind of detail I have to work more to sort out exactly. I have tended, when I see, I don't want to be disparaging, when I see funny clothes that do not look Greek in Greek art, trying to figure out what they could be connoting, what they could be denoting. And I'm using this term Persian, but very, very loosely. For me, one of the most extraordinary discoveries was that a representation of a Persian warrior in let's say, the 3rd quarter of the 5th century BC, is carrying a weapon that is a Western Anatolian weapon. He's garbed like a Persian, he's holding an Anatolian weapon, which leads one to imagine that maybe people fighting within the Persian imperial forces in their conscript units might actually also be wearing Persian-looking dress, what a Greek would see as Persian. So the whole question of vestimental identity is even more complicated, I see now, than I saw 15 years ago when I first started worrying about this.